Hi, welcome to MashableReads, Mashable's social book club, where we bring together members of our community with an author to talk about the best new titles in fiction and nonfiction. My name is Nora Grenfell. I'm on Mashable's community team. Joining us today is Joshua Ferris, author of To Rise Again at a Decent Hour. Thanks so much for joining us, Josh.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Nora.
So over the course of our Hangout, I'll be asking Josh some questions about the book. We have some other people on the Hangout who have some questions for him, and we'll be bringing in some questions from members of our community. So I want to just get started. To Rise Again at a Decent Hour tells the story of Paul O'Rourke, an atheist dentist who's avidly opposed to being on social media and the internet in general, but he finds his identity appropriated by a mysterious entity, and that changes his entire life. Josh, where did you get the inspiration for this story?
Well, I mean, it came sort of in stages, right? Because if I could just come up with a book and then just write it, I would have written it in about 6 months. But it took me a little longer than that. So I started with the idea of a fake religion, of a new religion, of an ancient religion that may or may not be real, and kind of moved from there. So there was a lot of hit and miss for a long time until I sort of landed on the dentist, and then after I had the dentist and the ancient religion, I folded into social media, and that kind of brought everything all around. So, at that point it was a novel. It wasn't just me scribbling.
Mm-hmm. And so where did you find the dentist? Because he seems like the catalyst to the rest of the story, but that's not something that people would typically think of as driving, great, exciting literature.
Yeah. Dentistry is kind of underserved in literature. It's kind of a fascinating profession with its own dubious history and colorful characters and shiny tools. And I'd never really seen a thoroughly convincing dentist. Once in a while they crop up as side characters, but you don't really see the focus being on dentistry. And I'm kind of fascinated by dentistry and dentists. I mean, when I go in there, I am one of the rare people that don't just flee, as quickly as you possibly can. I kind of want to stick around and ask what their lives are like and find out more about the people behind the tools. So I guess I was just interested in the dentist. I also saw, right around the time that I started to conceive the book, this great movie called Best Worst Movie, which I think is about the movie Troll 2. I think maybe I'm getting a nod from Jeff there.
Yeah, Troll 2.
Yeah, awesome movie. It's a documentary about Troll 2 and how terrible Troll 2 is. Well, the star of Troll 2 is now a dentist, and he's a really cheery, happy dude who's opposite almost in every way from my narrator. But I kind of wanted to pay homage to that dude.
Got it. So To Rise Again is not your first novel, it's actually your third. Is there anything that was different in your writing process this time around, or anything you knew this time that you wish you had known for your other novels?
I think there was a lot more attention paid at the sentence level. When I wrote my first book, I was just sort of possessed by it. I knew how to write it, and so I did it very quickly. Like I did it in about 14 weeks. My second novel took a little longer, but it was such a different book than I was accustomed to writing, a different story than I was accustomed to writing, and I was really trying to figure out the tone of that book. Here I was much more at ease to make sure that every single sentence was chiseled in a way, I suppose, and so it really kind of reads much smoother, I think. I don't know that I would recommend that way of writing because it's such a pain in the ass. Like you have to make things are so perfectly in place, but it does make it for a fluid and hopefully a very enjoyable read sentence to sentence.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, you could really get lost in those sentences. Okay, so sort of shifting gears, your narrator, Paul O'Rourke, really considers social media to be villainous, and there are several points in the book where he sort of loses it over social. Do you share any of those feelings that he has?
I don't engage a whole lot with social media, but it's more out of, I suppose, indifference than anything. It's not I don't have an animus toward it. I think that with respect to him, and I think with respect to a lot of people, you kind of decide what social media means and how much meaning you invest in it kind of depends on your personality. This is a guy that's pretty, he's pretty cramped. Like he doesn't have a whole lot. He doesn't have a very expansive soul when you first meet him. So he is naturally going to think of social media, I think, as another opportunity to sort of oppress him and make him feel miserable.
Mm-hmm.
And then he meets the guy, virtually. He meets the guy who is impersonating him. And that guy's kind of got it figured out. He's a much happier dude in general, and he likes social media quite a lot. And I think for Paul, the thing that separates Paul from a total curmudgeon is that he's capable of seeing the possibility that other people have figured it out better than he has. So he's attracted to this guy who sees social media in a different light, who in fact is using social media to kind of advance the message of a new religion. And that's a very different perspective than what Paul has. So I think the predominant perspective in the book is one of like, social media sucks. It kind of makes us all feel, claustrophobic and oppressed maybe by the wonderful Instagram portfolios that people have and the pictures that are so, perfect of everyone's meals. And that's how he's sort of seeing it.
Mm-hmm.
From a different perspective of the book, you see somebody actually using social media in very innovative and convincing ways.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'd like to turn the mic over to MJ, who's with us here and has a question for you. MJ, you want to chime in?
Hi. Yeah, so throughout reading the book, I noticed that Paul, and specifically, but some of the other characters too, obsessed over three things: social media, religion, and baseball and sports. So I was wondering if that coupling or that pairing of things was intentional, or what kind of connections were you trying to draw in the book by having those characters obsess over those three things?
MJ, did I slip this question to you before this?
You did not. You did not.
Here's what I'm thinking. Religion obviously has a long and storied history in the human race. Baseball, a much shorter one, and then obviously social media, a much shorter one than that. But I sort of saw it as the past, present, and the future. So I thought of like religion as being such a shaping force, such a monolithic force in culture and history. And in America, in any event, sports and baseball in particular has been a national, it's a national pastime, but really a national obsession for, more than a good 100 years. It's a short period of time with respect to religion, but it's the present. It's where I think a lot of people have spent, their lives. They're living their lives through baseball, living their pastimes. Their hobby is baseball. Their obsession is baseball. They're very fixed in a way that I think really kind of supplants religion. And then in terms of the future, I see social media doing that. I see like it has this capacity, so rarely seen in terms of like new inventions, to really sweep us up. I think it already has swept us up. And so I really saw those three things as sort of functioning in very similar ways, but in different periods of time. And I see them sort of competing and also supplanting one another, and especially the past and the future, the way in which religion and social media can intersect and relate and either bring us together or tear us apart in these various ways. Those things were on my mind for sure.
Related to that, I have a question. Paul is very traumatized by the Red Sox winning the World Series, and his way of explaining that to himself seems to be, that it's easy to root for a winning team, and he, felt so proud of himself for being able to root for a losing team. But why is it so important to Paul to suffer in his admiration of something? It's even when he's in love, it doesn't feel real to him unless it's combined with a whole lot of suffering.
Yeah. Well, at the time I was thinking about how similar the Red Sox losing streak was to the second exile in Jewish history. So for a long, long time, the Jews had not been able to reclaim Jerusalem, and then finally they did. And then, things got kind of really sticky for Israel. And similarly, I thought, well, there's over here, there's like the the Red Sox, who haven't won in 86 years, and then when they do, this guy doesn't really know. Well, okay, now how do I behave as a kind of like winner? How do I behave as like the dude on the the top of the mountain? And I think he's just kind of confused from a personal point of view. He doesn't know how to react to his team once they start acting a whole hell of a lot like the Yankees. So I saw a comparison between those two things, and he's driven to suffer just because he's been kicked out from all. He doesn't know to whom he belongs. He's adrift. He's at sea, and he doesn't really know where to locate his source of happiness. He thinks everybody gets it better than he does. He's alienated. Social media drives him nuts. Anything and everything can drive him nuts. And I think that is basically the source of the book's, kind of the heart of the book, because eventually he's going to have to find his way out of that. He's going to have to find some source of happiness if he's going to live in the world.
Yeah, well, so must we all. All right. Turning it over, Jeff, who's right there next to MJ, in case anyone is wondering who that is. You have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I actually have a couple now. But I wanted to riff off a little bit of what we talked about earlier. I'm just curious, what kind of work did you do in researching social media? Like, who did you look for in terms of reference for the stuff that you wrote about that aspect of the book? And a follow-up to that is, do you kind of distinguish social media from the internet in general, or do you think of them as sort of the same thing?
Well, to answer the first question, one of the best things that I did right around this time was call Facebook. So he gets, he gets a Facebook page is made in his name, and I thought, well, what does like a real analog dude do when this happens? And of course, he would pick up the phone and call some 800 number. And it was pretty fascinating. I don't know if it's still like this, but in 2011, when I did that, it said, Facebook user operations does not receive telephone calls, basically. And so there was no real way of communicating with the internet itself. Like the internet is fascinating because social media and the internet, it makes people communicate. There's probably nothing better in the world, nothing more mind-boggling in the world than these things to get people communicating. But how do you communicate to the internet itself and sort of like rectify wrongs or correct mistakes, or even simply sort of address yourself? I found that to be a great challenge because it's become, even its short lifespan, this monolithic thing where you might be able to sort of communicate who you are, but if there's an error, or if there's some kind of misrepresentation, much harder to correct. So a lot of my research went along those lines in terms of like what this phenomenon is and how does the individual person encounter it, not use it, but encounter it. How might somebody like Paul, who's resistant to nearly everything, try to penetrate it and understand it? It's not like using it, because using it you can do anything. Like the other day, I was talking to my mother, who didn't know she was on Twitter. She kept saying, "Do you follow me? Do I follow you? Who's following who?" She's very confused about how one follows the other. And instead of just getting on Twitter and like tweeting and then receiving tweets or searching people out, she was like, how does this thing work? She was very confused because it seemed like it was like almost like a building that had no doors. So there's a way in which you can kind of like approach the internet and social media like that, as if you're outside of it and you need to get in and you don't know how to access it, which is very similar to my character. Or you can just simply like start using it, and suddenly, without even knowing it, you're actually inside the building. So that my focus was like on somebody on the outside who thinks of it as this impenetrable edifice. What was the second question?
Do you think of the internet and social media as the same thing?
I don't know. I mean, I think back when the internet was first coming out, it was probably, what was I, like 20, right? I was probably 20 by the time I got my first email account. Maybe I was a little older, actually. No, I was probably 20. At that time, like, I remember being scandalized at some college bar where we found out a friend had met her new boyfriend online. Like we were like, oh, you sure it's you sure it's his name? You sure that's his name? Do you think he has a record? Where did he really come from? At that point in time, like everybody was shadowy. Everybody on the internet was shadowy. Then when the Internet 2.0 came out, which I think is pretty synonymous with social media, it was like after the moment in time where pets.com seemed to be what the internet was, right? A place where you would go not to find online stuff, but to get cheap deals and have stuff delivered to your house. That was okay, but the social end of things was not. Then social media really kind of became synonymous to some extent with the internet, and at that point, everybody was unreal or doctored in a different way than when they were originally. Originally, they were all predators. They were all hiding. They had things deep and dark in their secret. They basically lived in alleyways. Now everybody lives in mansions, right? Everybody lives in the perfect. Everything is curated. Everything looks right. Personality's been smoothed out so that things look very, very good. So in some ways, they're both false reflections of the world, but they're also kind of like fantasies or dystopias or utopias or whatever. So we have a way of kind of like making the internet both the best and the worst. I think that's not really the internet because the internet's much bigger than that, but it is a very large reflection of what the internet is and can be.
Yeah.
Cool.
Was that it, Chef? Did you have any more questions?
I did have another question, which was if this got made into a movie, who do you think would do a good job of playing Paul?
Matthew Broderick.
Ah, that's a good one.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
I think he'd work.
So you thought about that before?
Did you have him in mind at all when you were writing, or is that an afterthought?
Well, I had him in. I didn't have him in mind because I was writing this distinct character that was basically just like entirely verbal, or not verbal, but written. He was a written thing. So I didn't, because I don't really think, oh well, here's the guy I have in mind. I'm gonna try to capture him on a page. He's just like this this written force. But when I would reflect kind of distantly, I would think a lot about Matthew Broderick because I thought he was perfect as somebody who would play the character in a movie.
Yeah. That's great. Okay. We have a question from one of our readers online, part of our MashReads community. His name is Jay. Jay's question, I should say first, he's an English major and Spanish minor at Georgia State University. Hello, Jay. And his question was, To Rise Again at a Decent Hour has a lot of similarities to Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 49 in regards to conspiracy and secret societies. How much research did you do prior to writing this novel? Yeah, I think it's a good question. Did you read the Torah in its entirety?
Yeah, I did. I mean, it's a great question. When I went to college, I was suddenly aware, like taking a history class, I was suddenly aware that there was a great consensus about what had happened historically. Like, no matter what it was, like if you go into this class over here on, the Peloponnesian War, there was this really firm understanding of what happened in the Peloponnesian War. And then if you go over here to the Civil War, there's once again a kind of fairly smoothed out consensus of what had happened. I find that interesting insofar as history is just a very contingent thing, and it's a very, it's built by narratives, and those narratives get kind of fixed in stone, and everyone can agree what they are. But at some point in time, history is a very contingent thing. It's a very, the old adage is history is written by the winners. It points out that history is an authored thing. And so as I was going through college and thinking about these things, and then later, I was thinking about, well, why couldn't we just imagine the possibility of a radically different historical understanding? One that actually did include this religious group that I created for the book, or that, say, Pynchon created for The Crying of Lot 49, which was Thero. So it was very much on my mind, like the possibilities, especially as a novelist who can imagine these possibilities, what it would be like for history just to be tweaked and for us to be talking about entirely different things when we talk about the Peloponnesian War or the American Civil War or whatever the case may be. So, you know, I did do a lot of research into how those communities and secret societies and cabals were formed, and then also the mythologies about them. So not only how they were formed, but how other opinions about them were formed, and how those actual creations work, or actual creations worked against the myth of the creation, and you know what that stuff looked like, and then built my own within the novel.
Wow. Great. So I think we're getting close to the end of our time. Josh, is there anything else you wanted to add to our conversation before we sign off?
Yeah, in the background there with Jeff and MJ, there's an old CPU. Is that, or what do you call it? The monitor. Yeah. Is that thing functioning?
No.
No. Okay. That's all I had to add.
IBM.
Yeah. That's our video studio. We have a lot of props in there.
Sure.
So if you're a subscriber to the Mashable YouTube channel and you're watching this there, I'm sure you see lots of things you're familiar with. Okay, well that's it for now. I want to thank Josh so much for joining us. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. If you want to learn more about MashableReads, you can follow the hashtag MashReads on Twitter or like our page MashableReads on Facebook, speaking of social media. It's been a pleasure speaking to you today, Josh. And yeah, if you haven't read To Rise Again at a Decent Hour yet, it's certainly worth your time. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, Nora. Thanks, guys.
Bye.